Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is Nader Nadery. He is a senior fellow with the Wilson Center's Indo-Pacific program, an associate fellow with the Astor Institute, and a visiting fellow with the Hoover Institute. Nader previously served as commissioner of the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission. He's just authored a new report. It's called Human Rights Under Siege: Salvaging the International Rights Regime in a Turbulent World Order. Nader, great piece of work. Thanks for joining us to talk about it.
Thank you for having me.
So last year, end of last year, we marked the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 75th anniversary. I want to ask you for a little bit of a history lesson before we dive into your report. How much was accomplished in the 75 years from the start of that document and that world order? One way to talk about it.
Well, thank you very much. There have been a lot achieved in the past 7.5 decades or 7 decades. What we have had in the 7 decades was a tall order of both rules that begin with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and then added with the international covenants, the civil and political rights, and many other international human rights laws. The body of international human rights laws were built up, and then along with it, the institutional setup for human rights evolved, strengthened, and expanded throughout the globe, both at the national level, but also internationally, with the United States leading most of the way, but also most of the United States allies, including other countries in Asia, from China to Egypt, involved in helping building these rule-based order in terms of developing the rules and joining hands. But US had a pivotal role in leading most of those, both in institutional, but also in terms of the body of the laws that were built up. But also a movement that was led by civil society and academia, a movement of human rights defenders, also have shaped a new culture, both a legislative culture, but also political culture. Again, led in the United States, supported generously through financial, but also through academic work, but spread and proliferated across the globe. And that new culture have forced domestic political actors, but also international actors to look into any of their actions in or within the lens of human rights and protection of human rights, and the body of the institutions that are there to advocate human rights have proliferated and expanded so significantly. And that's what we have had in 75 years since the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
So anyone who would read the report would see that what you have documented essentially is slippage in this international order. And I wonder why the report now. What were you observing which led you to dive into this and to do the research that ended up with this report?
Well, unfortunately, what we are witnessing, at least in the past 1 decade, there's a trend, and that trend, the first sign of it is an erosion of the multilateralism, and then also a rise in the nationalism, which this rise of nationalism have contributed into a decline in global advocacy for human rights. The number of human rights violations and the countries that systematically moved from protection of human rights and then more of rules that were in line with the global agenda and principles of human rights protection to more of shying away from it and restriction and suppression of human rights in major part of the world. Any study you look, you see in the past 10 years an increase in the level of human rights violations and a decline in rights and freedoms. The indicators on by Freedom House to any other major studies on assessing the state of the liberties and freedom, it shows this trend. But at the same time, we see this trend of moving from multilateralism is also suggesting that institutions that were basically in charge or were effective in promoting human rights globally and protection of human rights globally are losing their efficacy too. And that in itself is creating significant challenge, both in the countries where you have authoritarian regimes, but also in the countries where you have protracted conflicts, but also in the countries that were democracy not far from today, that an increasing level of restrictions on rights and freedoms. That made it to look much more deeper to see the root causes of this erosion of multilateralism and also the advocacy for human rights.
So that erosion of multilateralism, the rise of nationalism, not unrelated, the resurgence of authoritarian regimes. Have you given much thought to the whys? I know there's no single answer, but why is this happening now? Why is the world in the state it's in?
Yes, indeed. The report, I try to look and bring in a lot of data from both case studies of specific countries to the conduct of the United Nations Security Council, to primarily to retreat of the United States from a leadership role in promoting and advocating for human rights equally in all situations. To give one example, so the first one that we look at it, taking the significant role of the United States throughout this seven decades in promotion of human rights. Currently, we do see that same level of significance of United States in erosion of multilateralism, in erosion of human rights advocacy too. And therefore, when we look to policies that are stating to be human rights centric, but then the choices of policies and the options for policies in pursuit of foreign policies that the United States different administration, especially in the past 1 decade, are taking are contradictory to each other. And that in itself is creating a situation where human rights defenders in those recipient countries or other countries who are looking at the United States, if it is keeping to its principles of human rights centric foreign policy, if the United States is acting in, contradictory to its policy, in double standard, or it is treating friend and foes, partners and non-partners to the same standards, and therefore holding to that high moral authority that the United States have had. So one why is a decline in moral authority of the United States in human rights advocacy because of the wrong choices that were made, because of the contradictions between the policies and the measures and actions and the options that the US have chosen in pursuit of pure interest in foreign policy, not value-based interest, as it was a norm during the Cold War and beyond.
So this obviously didn't happen overnight. And I think back to when Jimmy Carter was president, human rights was his calling card to the world. And perhaps that was a high point in terms of emphasis on human rights. So we've seen a decline since then. Is it based on what you just described? Is it a focus on great powers competition at the expense of some of these values that had been front and center previously?
Yes, indeed, it didn't begin overnight. So what I traced is through this report, it began 2001, and where the U.S. first began to act as unilaterally in most of the cases, where in pursuit, for example, the war on terror, in pursuit of one objective that was to combat terrorism. United States have set wrong examples of diverting and moving away from its international obligation on human rights domestically and also internationally. And then build on that, we have had situations in the past 2 decades which have resulted in pursuit of pure interest in global competition. So as we see this transition period, beginning of multilateralism, the unipolarity have given its way to multipolarity. And in this competition, the pure short-term interests have pushed the United States and the political leaders in Europe also to look for short-term gains and short-term partnership that are not based on values that it was in the case in the past. And that in itself is pushing the United States to lose one of its significantly important and effective tool of its foreign policy and its power, which was the soft power, which is the protection of the ideals of human rights and democracy. So this multipolarity and the big global power competition is pushing also to a wrong direction.
I've had this discussion with other guests under different contexts, but essentially the theme seems to be that the world is experiencing post-Cold War drift in defining a new world order and an organizing principle that we can all agree upon and that we can act upon. Do you see your work in that context? Is this part of a larger decline across the globe where nations are struggling to figure out exactly what the new alliances are, what the new priorities are?
Exactly. As it happens in any transitions, the transitions are always marred with confusions, with unclarity and fear and anxiety. And it happens with big powers too. And as we are going through a definition of new period of our world in terms of how this new period is going to be shaped now, a lot of conflicts, competitions in different regions, partially over territory and new geopolitical situations that we have, but also competition in economy. And all of that also is a competition of this type of governance that we are facing too. And this new type of governance, both globally, but also among the key allies, is creating a pull and push. And what we do see, the rise of China, the rise of other powers, not yet global powers, but major competitors in this arena, the US is struggling to define its role. And I think it's not for power as strong, as leading as the United States to lose its side and be be in a situation of panic, that to lose where it shapes itself in this new global governance and its new orders of governance. US have had and has a long-standing history of sets of values and principles and the way of governance. It needs to look back to capitalize on those values and those strengths, and not to rush or lose the sight in this pull and push situation that defines this period of transition.
One way to read your report is that it's a direct challenge to the United States to do what you just said. I mean, you seem to describe the U.S. as, I'm not sure you use this terminology, but you've heard it before, the indispensable nation in this equation. And that if the U.S. leads, others may follow. Without U.S. leadership, things begin to become diffuse. Do you see this as essentially the role of the United States to kind of put Humpty Dumpty back together again? Because the erosion, we've seen lack of trust in other institutions, the United Nations chief among those.
Yes, indeed. The United States decisions and directions have a larger magnitude of impact on the direction that both the United States allies and the rest of the world would take. Now, the United States need first to take a pause and look at internally, because there's a lot of things happening internally, domestically. Taking on the issue of human rights, look at the level of partisanship that is today very obvious and a display at the United States Congress, a place where once it was seen, at least on the core issues of values and principles like human rights and democracy, there being always a bipartisan consensus, both domestically and internationally. That bipartisanship in support of these values in foreign policy and in favor of multilateralism and also domestically is no more there. So the first thing is that pause needs to be made there. There's no need to be on these issues to be led by impulsive short-termism and populism driven by social media and led by social media impulses. That requires a leadership that's careful, that's calculated, that is also patient, not tempted. The second issue is to look at the institutions that the United States itself shaped them globally, the United Nations and its affiliated institutions. The United States in the past 1 decade consistently and continuously tried to undermine the very institution that it put a lot of effort to build them. And it was part of its strength in the past. Now, the US needs to look back to revive those institutions, to bring back legitimacy to those institutions. The UN Security Council currently is a place for gridlock, an absence of substantial conversation where consensus to be built. It's polarized as it is the politics outside UN headquarters in New York and the rest of the United States and Europe and other places. So a move out of that is required to enable back the United States to see much more clearly the new direction that it wants itself and the rest of its partners to chart.
Nader, in the report, you go through a series of case studies where you look at circumstances in Myanmar or Afghanistan and other places. Can I ask you to pick one and tell us how it illustrates the larger problem that you're discussing?
I would pick two, if I may.
Of course.
You look at the countries, most of the 5 case studies that I presented, these are countries that either are currently major partners of the United States, or they were a major partner and are currently a major recipient of United States aid throughout many decades and years. So to look at, for example, Afghanistan, to begin with Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, the United States currently is one of the major provider of the aid. To not look creatively into the ways that the aid need to make an impact in empowering human rights defenders and local communities to stand for their own right, and also to hold this very brutal authoritarian regime that's in power there to make sure that they are held accountable and use its tools, for example, the global Magnitsky's bill and sanctions and different tools at its position, both at the region and internationally. You see that not much of those tools are being used. Or look at Bangladesh or Pakistan for that matter. In Pakistan, the United States annual country human rights report every year lists a long list of human rights abuses, while at the same time the United States continue for a long time to provide, despite those human rights abuses reported by State Department itself, provided a significant amount of aid, 15 years, $15 billion. Most of those aids were provided based on security interests. However, those short-term security interests would not be sustainable because Pakistan in key international arenas have not stood with the United States. So it's not a partnership based on values, but it's based on a short-term interest. On the other hand, you have India with a long list of human rights abuses also. But because the United States have other priorities in the Pacific region, therefore the United States does not hold India accountable on human rights violation. It does not raise human rights violations there. So there is a divide between what is the stated policy to what policy options are chosen in favor of a short-term interest. And that undermines the United States' credibility in international stages in defense of human rights.
Like any good report, you go on to make recommendations, and you've touched on many of them already: reviving U.S. leadership, UN reforms, rebuilding moral authority, prioritizing victims over strategic interests, and sanctions or more use of the Magnitsky Act or more strategic use of it. There's one we haven't talked about yet that I find really interesting, and I'd ask you about now, which is expanding the coalition. You talk about recruiting other nations to the cause who maybe in the past have been more into the background and now may be ready for more of a leadership role. Could you talk about that and give us some specific examples of nations that could be asked to play a more significant role?
Because what we see today, only United States by itself, for example, when it comes to sanctions, cannot control many other financial institutions and many other avenues within which the abusers could escape United States sanctions. And therefore, a coalition of like-minded, for example, recently the UK, Canada and the United States joined forces, and they have issued at the same time collective sets of sanctions on those who have violated human rights. And the impact of that has been much more significant because those individuals are not anymore able to escape the jurisdiction of the US institutions to go, for example, in Canada or to do businesses in UK. Now they're all collectively acting on that. But not only that, because we are facing different regional economies which are somehow, if not completely independent of the bigger global economy or the US economy, but at least they are in a smaller scale, are having the capability of allowing those under sanctions to operate in those economies. For example, the Middle East region, countries like United Arab Emirates or Qatar or Kuwait and even India and other places are bigger enough economies that can absorb or provide platform for some of these abusers while there are sanctions to be operating there. For example, there are 2 Afghans who have been sanctioned by US Department of Treasury, but none of their assets are in the territory where the United States can stop them from accessing them. Most of them are in the Middle East, in the United Arab Emirates, partly in Pakistan, in informal economy, in India. Those regional cooperation could enable the United States to act in those smaller markets to make much more effective the impact of the sanctions it applies on individuals who are abusers.
Great, thank you. I want to get a final thought from you on sort of the soft science element of this. When we talk about things like sanctions or whatever, technical solutions might be applied, there's also just advocacy in general, right? Speaking out. You yourself have been a singular voice for human rights in your work. Nations do it as well. Can you talk about why advocacy matters? I mean, we see in lessons from history that foreign or outside forces can only do so much to influence the politics or the reality within a nation, and yet it still seems to matter. Could you speak to that?
It's the advocacy in situations where the institutions of state are repressive or allowing so limited access to its population for redress or for access to justice, becomes so much significant, both nationally, domestically, but also internationally. So there are the human rights, the international human rights laws and the global sets of rights and freedoms are not unique to only one set of nations, not to the rest. In my experience as a human rights activist and human rights commissioner, in a country like Afghanistan, the value I've seen in the most remote villages of the country, the most important elements of rights are known to those individuals and are demanded not in the terms and language of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the same legal terminology, but for example, to be free from torture, to have the ability to speak your mind, to have access to education, to live with dignity. These are universally accepted rights, sets of rights, and it does not become restricted by any culture or any certain history. And therefore, those populations do want these rights to be respected and to be granted to them. When regimes are repressing or doesn't allow, in the cases of violation or restricting those, or doesn't allow redress, then the advocacy becomes the key element. And therefore, institutions of civil society domestically who are standing for human rights and protection of it need to be supported morally by international institutions and those who share, like the United States and others, who share the values of human rights, to be morally supporting those institutions. If governments are repressive and regimes are repressive and systematically violating human rights, for example, in case of Afghanistan, you have an application of gender apartheid against the entire population of female population of the country, where the female population are mostly on the street demonstrating and demanding their rights are being suppressed. There it becomes a moral responsibility for advocacy for US and the rest of the those like-minded nations to stand with them and to do what it requires to be done. And that's the strength of a bigger power like the United States with its soft power and the credibility that they had that need to be rebuilt so that the nations, other repressive governments could not stand against it to say, hey, you're not doing it everywhere, you're selective, we don't believe in what you're doing and you don't have the credibility. That need to be corrected.
Nader, thank you for your ongoing work in this most important area and also for this terrific report. I want to tell our viewers and listeners, if you'd like to read the entire report, and as much as we've talked about today, there's still that much more valuable information and analysis to be found in the full report. If you come to wilsoncenter.org, and at the top of the page, you'll see a programs tab. And if you click on that, you'll find the Indo-Pacific program, and that's where you'll be able to download the report free of charge. Nader, again, thank you for the report and thank you for today.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for the conversation.
We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thank you for your time and interest.